Alright, ladies and gentlemen, this video is going to be on the process of evolution, and it's going to tie in very nicely to the stuff we just discussed with DNA and our traits. So let's get to a quick review of that. For starters, it's important that you realize that your DNA gives you your amino acid sequence. Your amino acid sequence is the order of the pieces that make up your proteins. The amino acid sequence gives you your protein structure. And structure equals, hopefully you were able to say function in response. The last thing we discussed in terms of DNA was mutation. And mutation specifically is changes in your DNA. Well, if you look carefully, what you can see here is that changes in your DNA lead to changes in protein structure. Changes in protein structure lead to changes in protein function, which then leads to changes in your traits. So what's really important here as we begin our discussion of evolution is for you to consider that mutations lead to changes in our traits. Now, the thing about these changes in our traits, some of these changes can be bad, some of these changes can be neutral, meaning they aren't good and they aren't bad, and some of these changes can be good. Now, we mentioned that when we were discussing mutation, but what we never really talked about is what determines good, bad, or neutral. How is it that scientists decide that a mutation is bad or good? How is it that a organism with a mutation realizes it's bad or good or neutral? How is it that a mutation itself becomes bad or good or neutral? And understanding that, what it is that determines whether a mutation is good, whether a mutation is bad, or whether a mutation is neutral or irrelevant, that is the key to evolution. So let's talk a little bit about that. You have to understand that at the basic biological level, all organisms have only one purpose, and that purpose is to pass on your genes or to pass on your DNA from generation to generation. Now, I understand, you're like, oh, well, that's not the only reason that I have a life and I want to do all these things. That's not what I mean. Okay, the existential purposes of life are not what we are discussing right now. What we're talking about is the fundamental underlying force that drives life itself. Okay, and that is all about passing on your genes. All right. What this means is that at its heart, the main goal of any organism is to reproduce, because reproduction is simply passing on your genes to your offspring. Your offspring then can pass on your genes or their genes to their offspring, and then your genes, their genes, and whoever they reproduced with get those genes passed on to the next generation. And in essence, what happens is your genes get to exist forever, if they're useful. See, this is the thing. If you're going to reproduce, you have to survive. And survival can mean a whole lot of things. You live in the Arctic, survival means not dying from the cold. You live in the desert, survival means not dying because you're thirsty. You live in modern society, survival means being able to have the fundamentals of a typical life, a place to live, food, a way to generate income so that you can purchase things, a social group. Survival means different things depending on your situation. Traits are good if they help you survive to reproduce. Traits are bad if they make survival for reproduction more difficult. Traits are neutral if they do neither. Okay? And I mean, at its heart, this makes sense. All right? If you have a really good immune system, you're not going to get sick and die. So that's good because you get to survive. And if you survive, you reproduce. If you have some sort of autoimmune disease, so your body is destroying itself, that's bad because it is harder for you to survive. If you don't survive as well, then you don't get to reproduce. Okay? Whereas something like hair color, eye color, those tend to be neutral because they don't aid in your survival in any way, shape, or form. And so they're not good or bad. They tend to be more random in their effect. All right? Now, this is obviously a very simplistic look at it, and there's a whole lot of detail we could go into as to when things are positive, when things are negative, how some things that appear neutral could actually be positive or negative. But at its heart, if you have a good trait, it helps you survive. If it helps you survive, it helps you reproduce. If you have a bad trait, it doesn't help you survive, or it doesn't help you reproduce, or both. And if you're a neutral trait, you don't really affect it one way or the other. Having it does not make you reproduce and survive better. Having it does not make you reproduce and survive worse. Now, this of course begs the question, how do you know whether a trait is good, bad, or neutral? All right? And that gets to a fundamental connection between an organism itself and where that organism exists. So I mentioned earlier, when we were giving examples of things that help you survive, you have to survive in the freezing cold if you live in the Arctic. You have to be able to survive in a place with almost no water if you live in the desert. And it's important for you to realize that all organisms survive in an environment. And there are plenty of different environments all across the globe. There are a huge variety of environments. And environments include a whole lot of different aspects. Things like water. Do you have water? Do you not have water? Does it rain a lot? Is there fresh water? Is there salt water? Is your environment water? Let's not forget that the majority of the earth is covered in water and a lot of organisms live in it. The weather. Is it hot? Is it cold? Does the seasons change? Is it always the same temperature? How much sun do you get? Do you get a lot of sun? Also, don't forget rainfall is very important. Is there a lot of rain? Is there very little rain? Does the rain come all at once, like in that video we watched earlier in the year about the desert? Or does rain happen regularly? Okay? And this is an often forgotten aspect of the environment right here, but it's a really important one. Organisms do not live in their environment alone. There's got to be plants in your environment or you have no oxygen. There has to be plants in your environment or you have no sugar to eat. There are definitely microorganisms in your environment, and some of them are going to try and digest you. And do you have an immune system that can fight them off? There are going to be fungi in the environment. Some of those fungi can be bad. Some of those fungi are necessary for plants to survive. There are also going to be other animals in the environment. And what is your relationship with those animals? Are they hunting you? Are you hunting them? Do you look like another animal, so something is going to hunt you by accident? There's a lot of possibilities. And so the other organisms you exist with also are part of the environment you live in. So when we're trying to talk about whether traits are good or bad, the answer is determined by the environment you exist in. So a polar bear is great in the Arctic tundra because it's really hard for their prey to see them coming when they hunt. But a brown bear in the Arctic tundra doesn't have that advantage. But a brown bear in the woods has a great advantage because they're the same color as the trees. And this is the thing. Whether a trait is good, bad, or neutral depends on the environment, okay? It entirely depends on the environment you're in. And that's a really important aspect of evolution. If your traits are good, you survive and reproduce. If your traits are bad, you survive and reproduce less. But your traits are only good or bad based on the environment you're in. And if the environment changes, then your traits might not be so good anymore. And that's an important key term. Like this idea right here is one of the single most important things that we're going to talk about when we discuss evolution. Is that when we're saying your traits are good, bad, or neutral, the environment determines if they are good, bad, or neutral. Okay? And there's nothing else. So let's talk a little bit about the sequence of evolution. Your traits change at random. This is a really key idea. Far too often people believe that your traits change in response to the environment. That is not true at all. your traits change at random. And these random changes can basically be driven by two main things. The first is mutation, and the second is sexual reproduction. Mutation causes changes in your DNA, which can cause changes in your traits. If those traits are good for the environment you are in, that's an advantage. If they are bad for the environment that you are in, that is a disadvantage. And if the environment were to change, their status, is good or bad, could change. The thing about mutations is it happens slowly. Alright, we talked about how you only make a mistake when you copy your DNA every billion base pairs. Mutation is a very slow process. Whereas sexual reproduction is a very fast process. In fact, the entire reason sexual reproduction exists is so that we can cause changes in your traits at a higher rate. Now, this is what happens. You mutate, or your traits change due to sexual reproduction. And then what happens is, if the trait is beneficial in the environment that you are in, you survive. And you actually get to reproduce quicker and better than the other organisms that did not have the mutation. When that happens, okay, you have more offspring. Over large periods of time, I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands, millions of years, suddenly, the organism with the mutation, with the change, with the new trait, is the new normal. They are the most common version of the organism because that change, that new trait, that new feature gave them an advantage. And the older versions, who are not as adapted to the environment, and that's a key term here, adapted, tend to exist in smaller numbers, or in some cases, they exist not at all. And then this process repeats. New mutations, new changes due to sexual reproduction, and all of a sudden you have new organisms that are suddenly most common. This, of course, begs the question, how do we know all of this? And I think what we're going to do is wait for another presentation for that.